Next, coming to us from San Francisco, is a gentleman that has had a real hard time trying to get some cannabis out of the federal government in order to study this, the use of it on AIDS patients. Dr. Donald Abrams is running a clinical trial right now as we speak in San Francisco, and he is here to report to us the progress, I hope, of that trial. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Abrams.
Thank you, Al. I'd like to thank you and Mary Lynn and Patients Out of Time for inviting me back again to give you an update on where we stand now with current ongoing clinical trials of cannabis and pain. We do have compassionate use of cannabis ever since 1996. More people in San Francisco voted for cannabis than Clinton in that year. This law allowed for the right to possess and cultivate marijuana for medical purposes where medical use has been deemed appropriate and recommended by a physician. And the conditions for which cannabis is able to be recommended to patients are listed there at the bottom and end with any other illness for which marijuana provides relief. So certainly a broad spectrum of possible uses of cannabis. As you all are aware of the history of this, it was challenged immediately by the government with Shalala, McCaffrey, and Reno getting up there saying that it's not good. Physicians can't talk to patients about the use of medical cannabis. That led to an outcry from the physicians saying, yes, we can. And the bottom line there was that more research was necessary, which is a common ending in medical science. And so the Institute of Medicine was commissioned to do a report on the efficacy of cannabinoids and publish their findings in 1999, suggesting that in fact the accumulated data indicate a potential therapeutic value for cannabinoid drugs in 3 specific areas: pain relief, control of nausea and vomiting, and appetite stimulation. They mentioned in their report that the therapeutic effects of THC alone were best established, and that's because they really didn't allow the use of medical marijuana to be investigated up until quite recently. And they also remarked that the effects of cannabinoids were generally modest, with usually more effective medications for pain, nausea, vomiting, etc. Well, we in California are very fortunate that Senator John Vasconcellos, one of our state legislators, proposed to the state of California that, in fact, if the voters had passed this legislation saying that cannabis was useful for all these various conditions, perhaps we should allow investigators in the state to study its use, its efficacy or effectiveness in these conditions. And in fact, the legislature passed the Medical Marijuana Research Act in September of 1999, followed 1 year later by the establishment of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at the University of California. The mission of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research is to conduct high-quality scientific studies intended to ascertain the general medical safety and efficacy of cannabis products and examine alternative forms of cannabis administration. The center will be seen as a model resource for health policy planning by virtue of its close collaboration with federal, state, and academic entities. So truly an overarching mission of the center. These are the objectives, and again, they're all in your handout. But again, the primary one, to conduct and support clinical trials on the efficacy of cannabis. When Al mentioned that I had a hard time getting marijuana, that was for my earlier study, which is now published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Starting in 92, 93, 94, when I was applying to the federal government for marijuana to study in patients with AIDS wasting, I didn't understand that NIDA had a mandate from Congress to only supply marijuana for studies of it as a substance of abuse. As Alan Leshner, the former director of NIDA, told me, Donald, we are the National Institute on Drug Abuse, not for drug abuse. So in fact, their mandate is to study marijuana and other substances for their potential for abuse or the harm that they can cause, and not for the potential benefit, the medical benefit. Now, since '96, with the Compassionate Use Act and certainly with the establishment of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, the government has in fact made a mechanism available for the clinical investigators in California and elsewhere who have peer-reviewed clinical trials to obtain their marijuana for clinical investigation as an effective medical intervention. Again, it's their marijuana because NIDA remains to this day the only legal source of marijuana. And just to show you that getting approval to do a clinical trial from the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research Science Review Committee is just the first regulatory hurdle that we need to go through to conduct any of the clinical trials that are currently being conducted. Because we're doing research with a Schedule I substance, we need approval from the Research Advisory Panel of California. They used to be known as the California Research Advisory Panel, but when I used to give talks and call them CRAP, I think they decided to change their name. We then also have to get approval from the Department of Health and Human Services, from NIDA, from the FDA, from the DEA, and then from the institutional review boards at the university. And when I do studies in cancer, I also have to get yet another approval from the Cancer Review Committee at my institution. So currently, the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, and you can find this all out by going to the web page, which I'll give you the address coming up, or I did already, is conducting 16 clinical trials, and I think it's noteworthy that 8 of these focus on pain. And as you can see, I've highlighted that 4 of them actually are focusing on neuropathic pain. So yesterday I noticed that Sandra Walsh was here and gave her presentation on pain as well as cannabinoids and opioids, so I hope not to repeat too much what she said because she is the expert in this field. I am not a neurologist. I am an oncologist and an HIV doc, but I have an interest certainly in studying medicinal cannabis, and pain is something that both my cancer patients and my HIV patients share. So we know that there are elevated levels of the CB1 receptor, similar to the opioid receptor, found in areas of the brain that modulate processing of painful stimuli. CB1 and CB2 agonists have peripheral analgesic actions, and cannabinoids, we also believe, exert anti-inflammatory effects. The analgesic effects of cannabinoids are not blocked by opioid antagonists. So the study that we decided to do was in patients with AIDS-related peripheral neuropathy, which is a condition of pain in the feet, sometimes the hands, which is really not particularly amenable to any current therapies. Opioids are generally ineffective in the treatment of neuropathic pain. Acupuncture and antidepressants have been studied in clinical trials and have been found, both cases, to be no better than placebo antidepressants or sham acupuncture. Anticonvulsants, particularly Neurontin or gabapentin, are in common use currently, but patients do report anecdotally that marijuana, either smoked or eaten, has activity against neuropathic pain. And in fact, in the preclinical model of neuropathic pain, which is a mouse or rat tail on a hot plate, it has been demonstrated that cannabinoids are effective. So our study is divided into 2 phases: the pilot phase, followed by a follow-on randomized controlled study. The objectives of the pilot are to assess the analgesic effects of smoked marijuana in patients with HIV neuropathy. Again, the pilot is an open-label study where all patients are treated with active marijuana to test the feasibility for the randomized controlled trial that we would need to clearly demonstrate that cannabinoids or cannabis has effectiveness. Again, the plan was to do the randomized controlled study only if the pilot met our pre-specified criteria for effectiveness. And in addition, working with collaborators from our Pain Clinical Research Center at the University of California, we were not only going to investigate the effect of smoked marijuana on the patient's chronic neuropathic pain, but also subject the patient to an experimental pain model so that we can determine whether there's a difference of effect on experimental acute pain versus the patient's chronic clinical pain. The inclusion criteria are HIV patients with peripheral neuropathy. Now, this syndrome can be either related to HIV infection itself or to the drugs that we use to treat the patient, the nucleoside analogs. We did give patients, before entering the trial, a diary to keep for a week with a visual analog scale on which we asked them to rank their pain daily.